Hello and welcome to the first section of Unit 11. So this section is all about completing the square. So what completing the square is it's just another way to solve for the roots, or for the x-intercepts or the zeros. Those are all the same thing. So it's one way to find the roots of a quadratic equation when you can't necessarily factor it. Or you can still do it even if you can factor. So here are the steps to completing the square. So you can read over those if you'd like. I'm going to kind of skip to the example so I don't take time just reading it to you because you guys can read. So if I'm completing by the square, first step says move the loose number to the other side. So what that means is whatever number is not being multiplied times x or x squared, I want to move that to the other side. So previously we always wanted to make one side equal 0. So now we're kind of doing the opposite of that. We want to get that single number, or the c value, to the other side. So now I'll have x squared plus 6x equals 7. So next, what I'm going to do, the coefficient of the squared term must be 1. So the squared term is x squared here. We want the coefficient, or the number in front of it, or the a value is what it's talking about, to be 1. That's already 1, so we don't need to do anything. Sometimes this will be a different number and you'll have to divide everything by that number. Next step, step 3 says take half of the coefficient of the x term. So it's talking about the b value. So it's take half of b and then square it. So if I take half of 6, that's 3. Squared is 9. What we're going to do with this 9 is we're going to add it to both sides of the equation. So I'm going to add 9 to both sides. And then we'll end up with x squared plus 6x plus 9 is equal to 7 plus 9 is 16. So the reason we're doing that is because we are trying to create, on this left side here, a perfect square. So if you factored x squared plus 6x plus 9, you'd get x plus 3 squared equals 16. So the reason this factors to x plus 3 squared is that 3 is half of 6, it's half of b, and 3 is the square root of c, or 9. So whenever this number is half of b and the square root of c, you can write it as a perfect square. And also a has to be 1. So now that we have a perfect square on the left side, if I want to solve for x, if I get rid of the squared, it'll be really easy to solve for x. So if I want to get rid of a squared, I got to take the square root. So the square root of something squared, these two just cancel each other out. So x plus 3 is equal to the square root of 16. But remember, whenever you take the square root of something, it's always plus or minus. Because if I square a positive, it'll be positive 16. If I square a negative, it'll still be positive 16. So we have to write the plus or minus. Go over here. Then when we subtract 3 on both sides, I end up with x is equal to negative 3 plus or minus the square root of 16. But I know the square root of 16 is 4, so I can still simplify that. So x is equal to negative 3 plus or minus 4. So since these are both whole numbers, I can combine them. So I have, what this is saying is I have negative 3 plus 4, and I also have x is equal to negative 3 minus 4. See, plus or minus. So negative 3 plus 4 is 1. Negative 3 minus 4 is negative 7. So our two answers are x equals 1 and x equals negative 7. So going back up to this step right here, when you subtract this 3 right here, put it in front of the plus or minus, because if you do plus or minus square root of 16 minus 3, that just looks weird. So -3 or whatever this number ends up being, plus or minus whatever this is. All right, so next example, example 2. Going to do the same thing. So notice that a is 1, so that's good. That means we're not going to have to divide. So first thing I'm going to do is get rid of c. I want to move c to the other side. So subtract 12 on both sides. So then we end up with x squared plus 8x equals -12. Next, take the square root, or excuse me, take half of b. So b divided by 2 is 4. Then square that, and we get 16. So this is the number that I'm going to add to both sides. So I add 16 on both sides. That is the number that will make the left side a perfect square. So x squared plus 8x plus 16 is equal to -12 plus 16 is 4. So now that I've completed the square on this side, I can factor it into a perfect square. So half of 8 is 4, square root of 16 is 4. So I know I'm going to have x plus 4 squared is equal to 4. So if I'm trying to solve for x, I want to get rid of this squared because I just want x by itself. So if I have just something squared on one side, I can take the square root. So the square root and the squared cancel each other. So x plus 4 equals the square root of 4. But remember, don't forget that plus or minus. Anytime you take the square root, it's always got to be plus or minus. Then subtract 4 on both sides, and we get x is equal to -4 plus or minus the square root of 4. But we know we can reduce the square root of 4. Square root of 4 is just 2. So x is equal to -4 plus or minus 2. Since these are both whole numbers, I can simplify. So x equals -4 plus 2, and x equals -4 minus 2. So -4 plus 2 is -2. So one of our answers is -2, and then -4 minus 2 is -6. So x equals -2 and x equals -6. So moving on to the next page. Example 3. So again, we're going to be completing the square. Notice that a is 1, so that's good. Again, first thing we want to do is move c to the other side. So add 48 to both sides. And then x squared minus, not plus, minus 8x is equal to 48. Next, take half of b. Half of 8 is 4, and then we're going to square it. So 4 squared is 16, so just like the last one. And that's the number I'm going to add to both sides to create a perfect square on the left. So x squared minus 8x plus 16 is equal to 48 plus 16 is 64. Now I should have a perfect square on the left side. So if I take half of 8, I get 4. Square root of 16 is 4. So I do have a perfect square. Since this is a minus sign, this will be a minus. So x minus 4 squared is equal to 64. Next step, get rid of that squared, so take the square root on both sides. So then we're left with x minus 4 is equal to plus or minus the square root of 64. Add 4 on both sides. So x is equal to 4 plus or minus the square root of 64, but I know square root of 64 is 8. Again, these are both whole numbers, so I can simplify them even more. So I have 4 plus 8, and then 4 minus 8. So 4 plus 8 is 12, and then 4 minus 8 is -4. So a couple more examples, and then we'll be done. So example 4, solve by completing the square again. So notice that we don't have 0 over there. That doesn't really matter in this case because I'm just going to move c to the other side anyway. So if I have a plus 21, the opposite of that is minus 21. So I'll be left with x squared minus 8x equals 6 minus 21 is negative 15. So next step, divide b by 2 and square it. That is the number that I'm going to add to both sides, so plus 16. That's not how you write 16. So x squared minus 8x plus 16 is equal to negative 15 plus 16 is 1. I should have a perfect square on the left because half of 8 is 4, square root of 16 is 4. So again, it's going to be x minus 4 because we have a minus sign right here. So x minus 4 squared equals 1. Take the square root of both sides to get rid of the squared. So x minus 4 is equal to plus or minus the square root of 1. Add 4 to both sides. And we get x equals 4 plus or minus the square root of 1. We know the square root of 1 is just 1. So x is going to equal 4 plus 1 and 4 minus 1. So our two x values will be 5 and 3. So I know I'm moving a little faster as we're going along, so if you need to pause the video, feel free to do so. But hopefully you're starting to get the hang of it. And then our last example, okay, this time we have an a value that is not 1. So the first thing I'm going to do is I notice all of these, since a is 2, all of these are even numbers. So that means I can divide everything by 2. If I divide both sides by 2, I still won't have any fractions or decimals. I'll have all whole numbers. So 2 divided by 2 is 1. So I just have x squared. 12 divided by 2 is 6. So 6x. And then 10 divided by 2 is 5. 0 divided by 2 is 0. So after I divide everything by 2, I still have all whole numbers in the a, b, and c value. So now I can just complete the square from here. So I start with step 1. I subtract 5 on both sides. So x squared plus 6x equals negative 5. Then I take b divided by 2, and I get 3, and then I need to square that number. So 3 squared is 9. So x squared plus 6x plus 9, because remember, this is the number that we add to both sides. I forgot to write that though, plus 9 plus 9. Negative 5 plus 9 is 4. So since I added 9 to the left, this should be a perfect square now because half of 6 is 3, and then the square root of 9 is 3. So x plus 3. So again, the sign in here will always be the same as the one after x squared. And that's squared equals 4. Take square root. So x plus 3 equals plus or minus. We already know the square root of 4 is 2, so it's going to be plus or minus 2. Subtract 3 on both sides and you get x equals negative 3 plus or minus 2. So x is equal to negative 3 plus 2, and x also equals negative 3 minus 2. So negative 3 plus 2 is negative 1. Negative 3 minus 2 is negative 5. So those are our two answers. So that's completing the square.